Restoring a Bing Clockwork train, this is part 3. Winding up the Clockwork motor, sanding and filling the metalwork, painting the chimney and smoke box. So here goes the first full wind. I hope this old spring can take it after all these years. I've not been able to wind up this engine because I didn't have a key, but I bought this one via eBay. The mechanism is winding up very smoothly. It's not notchy and it's not sticking, so it's looking good so far. Well, it wasn't until this happened. The key broke, like you see here, and it looks like something from a cartoon, where the cartoon character sticks his finger down the barrel of a shotgun. Obviously this key is nowhere near strong enough. I think it must be made from cast brass, and that's why it broke. The eBay seller though is sending me a replacement, which I will reinforce before I use. Just by chance, in the far recesses of my workshop I found this key. I don't know what it's from, but it allowed me to complete the wind-up of the Clockwork motor. I made sure that I didn't overwind the motor, and when I released the brake, off it goes. Now that all the moving parts have been thoroughly cleaned and oiled, it runs very smoothly indeed. And it runs for quite a long time. When the engine's back together, with both the weight of the engine and the frictional losses around the track, I think the engine would run around the track for quite a while. I mean, it's not as good as a steam engine, and it's not as good as an electric motor, but it's fully self-contained and it's a bit of a free spirit. And that's enough time spent playing with the Clockwork motor. Time to get down to some work. Now, I'm not going to repaint this engine, so any purists out there, relax, don't start twitching over your keyboard. I'm just going to repair the paintwork. The main coat of paint on the roof is not the original coat. As I start to rub it off with the sandpaper, lines appear from the original paint underneath. I'm only going to repaint the parts where it's necessary to do so owing to damage. This front buffer beam was completely mangled, nothing like you see it now. It took me quite a while using my Barco spanner and various pliers to straighten it out. And now, because it's still a bit uneven, I'm coating the entire front of this buffer beam with JB Weld. And once this is set, I will rub it down and use some cellulose putty to get quite a good finish on the front buffer beam. And I will really do my best to match the paint colour when I repaint the buffer beam. After the JB Weld has set, I will be using some cellulose putty to cover this to get a good finish. I also applied a fillet of JB Weld up inside the corners of the buffer beam because the metal was damaged in both these areas. To apply the JB Weld, I'm using an old plastic card that came from a local DIY store. You could use a credit card for this, but I don't have a credit card, so I don't do that. I have a debit card though, that's a lot better. I don't mean that a debit card is better for spreading JB Weld on a buffer beam than a credit card. It's just that with a debit card, you cannot spend money that you don't have. I'm going to make new buffers for this engine and for all the carriages. And in this clip, I'm just poking a screwdriver through where the buffers fit. Because if I don't do that and the JB Weld covers the holes, once it's set I won't know where the holes are. And similarly, I'm using a piece of wood to clear the slot at the front where the coupling comes through. Once the JB Weld has set and I rub it down thoroughly and then coat the front of the buffer beam with cellulose putty and then rub that down, it should look okay. This is day 2 of the chimney job and it's still looking alright. And it looks alright from this angle too. So it's time to paint the chimney. I'm going to use Phoenix Precision Paints Grey Single Pack Etch Primer for this, but I'm not going to spray it for obvious reasons. It would go everywhere. Instead, I'm spraying some into the cap and then using a paintbrush to apply it to the chimney. I'm being very careful not to get any runs or drips, and after painting the chimney with the primer, I thought I would also paint the hinge floor panel that bridges the gap between the engine's footplate and the tender. I'm assuming that the paint underneath is enamel paint, so I'm only putting a thin coat of paint on this panel because I don't want the solvent in the etch primer to attack the old paint. As the smoke box is not perfectly round, there are gaps around the chimney. I'll be filling these gaps and then painting the entire smoke box. But apart from the roof and the buffer beam, that's going to be about it for the painting. Back to the roof now. This is very laborious. This paint is well stuck to the metal. So it's time to call in the cavalry in the form of my Proxxon motor tool fitted with a flapper wheel. This cuts through the paint and gets right down to the original primer. And now a final rub down with some sandpaper before applying a skin of cellulose putty. This, by the way, is cellulose thinners or lacquer thinner. So I apply the putty and then I brush the cellulose thinners on, which smooths it all out. I often do this because it means you don't have to rub it down quite as much. And then using the same cellulose putty, I skin the roof. And once again, I'm using the paintbrush dipped in some cellulose thinners to even out the putty that I've applied. And this will avoid the need for excessive rubbing down of the roof. 24 hours later and the JB Weld has set on the buffer beam, so I've rubbed it down. And once again I'm using my Proxxon motor tool, but this time with a small grinder fitted to enlarge the holes where the buffers are going to fit. And in this clip I've skinned the buffer beam with some cellulose putty. Once I've rubbed down the cellulose putty, I will clean the slot in the front of the buffer beam using a needle file. Time for a bit of painting. This is Humbrol Matte Black. And we're going to use this to paint the chimney, starting with the inside and moving all the way down onto the smoke box. And as you can see, it looks very shiny and very wrong, but it won't look like this when the job's finished. This is a good trick. I'm using a piece of cotton cloth to clean the joint between the new paint on the smoke box and the old paint at the end of the boiler part. All I have to do now is wait until the paint has dried, and so it doesn't look too new, I will give the smoke box another coat of paint. But that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.